"I can't close my legs," Mira cried into the night, voice small and panicked, as if the words themselves might split her open. She had never said anything so raw to another living soul. She had buried fear behind practiced hands and a steady ledger of herbs. The moonlight made the crescent at her hip shimmer, an impossible sliver of silver beneath the edge of her skirt, and heat pooled between her thighs, spreading humiliation like quicksilver. Her palms were slick with blood from the gash along her wrist. The forest smelled of damp earth and old wolves. When she looked up, all breath stopped, not because of the claws or the teeth she'd always feared, but because Kieran stood in the path like a carved statue, moonbite in the hollow of his throat glowing faint and answering the moon's call. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Kieran's face was a map of wars, scars that cut through cheekbones, a permanent fold of severity between brows. But his eyes were softer and more dangerous than she had imagined. Gray like the peat bogs around Grayfen, with a silver ring flaring when the moon touched him. The pack Alpha moved as if the world bent around his steadiness. Yet in that instant, his jaw loosened and something unreadable flickered. Sympathy, hunger, dread, an electric nut she felt in her bones. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and the words were as soft as wind over the moors, but they carried the force of law. Even saying so felt like a betrayal. The border of Grayfen had rules older than the human priests who burned herbs and called lycanthropy a sin. But she was a healer. She lived on the thin edge of human and wolf song, where the nights were deep and the needs were many. She had run from her village with a bleeding hand and a secret that named itself without permission, and now she had run into the den. Mira was practical by necessity, hands calloused from poultices, a mind attuned to measurements and the precise tilt of a skull. She could stitch a wound with thread finer than a widow's whisper, and she had a stubbornness the size of a barn. But the crescent had unsettled the ledger of her life in ways no poultice could soothe. She had felt it the first night, an impossible warmth at her hip, and the sudden pull of moonlight in her chest that made her walk out to the river and hum lullabies she'd never learned. Nights had always been her solace. They hid her from prying neighbors and priests who accused anything different of sin. They had not prepared her for being seen, for the way a leader with a crown of wolves would read her like a page. Behind Kieran, the Grayfen pack made itself visible in the dark, silhouettes shifting like curtains, boots and leather, eyes that reflected the narrow beam of moon. Among them, Soren watched with a held breath. He stood to one side, shoulders broad, hands curled into the hem of his coat, not in anger, but in restraint. There was a history in the way he looked at Kieran, a loyalty so thick it had been almost romantic once, before it had calcified into a second skin. Soren had loved Kieran as boys love impossible things. He'd learned to fold that love into duty. Now he watched the stranger on the path with a hunger folded into something like hope. "You're hurt," Kieran said, taking a step forward that was both command and offer. The pack shifted as one, protective muscle tightening. "Show me." Mira held up her wrist. Blood beaded where the blade, an old hedger's knife, likely, had sliced her. Her fingers trembled not only from pain, but from a heat she couldn't name. She had fled at first light with a bundle of salves, a small jar of moonwort, and a skirt that suddenly felt like accusation. She began, then caught herself. Words were dangerous. The world she knew taught her to be small, to hide odd things. She had planned to go to the next village, to trade herbs and patch wounds without ever saying more. but a wolf's howl, too close, had sent her running, and she had stumbled here. Fate or folly, she did not know. Kieran's gaze flicked lower, to the silver crescent peeking from the curve of her hip. The hairs on his forearms rose. He had seen marks before. Wolf bite scars on boys claimed in adolescence, old rituals, the pale crescent tattoos that betokened pact. But this was neither. This mark seemed to hold the moon in miniature, an actual cold light beneath skin. In the old tongue, it had a name no longer spoken aloud, moon-touched. Humans who carried the bite were rare and dangerous, bridges between species whose existence could be a new kind of power or an abomination, depending which pack sang the tale. "Kier!" Soren's voice was a rasp, shorter than the night. There was a sharpened edge now. The old, quiet love had folded into something fragile and possessive. "We should bind her for the safety of the pack." Kieran's jaw tightened. Protecting the pack was his breath. His rule was iron. He had built peace through sacrifice and unyielding edges. Gray fence borders were peppered with graves because Kieran had chosen to be stern rather than merciful. The thought of bringing a human within the den without counsel churned him. There were laws, ancient, brittle things that argued for turning humans away, for leaving the unknown alone. There were other laws that still hum under skin. If the Alpha chose, then the law bent like sapling before storm. The choice would not be his alone. Rival packs watched with hawk eyes and hungry hearts. Word of a moon-touched human could fracture the fragile treaties Kieran had held together with promises and blood. Mira saw the debate like thunder moving across a field. She felt small, not in stature. She was of average height, but as if she might be folded into paper and tucked away. "I can close my legs," she said, quicker than she wanted, the sentence brittle with shame. I don't know what this is. I was at—" Her lies stumbled over each other. The truth wanted to rise. The tug of the moon, the way she had heard wolves calling her name in the trees, the scent of the pack under Kieran's skin that had startled something raw inside her. She held the memory close like a forbidden thing. Kieran's face evened. He stepped closer, not touching. The pack's mood changed. Even the air seemed charged. "You came to Grayfen," he said slowly, tasting each syllable. "You should have gone to the village healer. Why run to our borders?" Her answer was a single truth. "Because I thought you would know," she whispered. It was not bravado. It was not logic. It was a human plea, exposed and trembling. "I heard the wolves at night. I woke with the moon in my chest. I thought if anyone understood." Soren barked a laugh that was not mirth. He said, voice rough. "They think we understand," he said, voice rough. "They think wolves will make sense of the strange. Most of the time, stranger things make only one thing clear: danger." His gaze flicked to Kieran, an unspoken accusation riding the movement. Old rumors of Kieran's choices years ago, the broken pact with a neighboring pack, the woman he had not claimed, and the son he had lost, hung between them like spider silk. Kieran's hand clenched, then relaxed. "Tell me what happened," he ordered, not as question, but as law. His voice contained the weight of authority that both terrified and steadied her. Mira sat on a curling root, the world tilting. Her pulse thudded in her ears like a drum. She rolled up her sleeve and showed the shallow cut, the damp hair that had matted at the temple where she'd been struck when a man in the village had noticed the crescent as she washed. "I was at the elder's well," she said, voice steadying as she found the cadence of storytelling that came from stitching people back together. "A priest saw something under my cloak. He accused me of witching. They tried to bind me. I ran." Kieran's pupils contracted. He understood the weaponization of fear. It had been used against his pack in subtle ways, by men in suits and by other alphas who wanted to force his hand. A human branded by the moon, if turned on the public, could be a banner. Kieran felt the sharp edges of a decision: protect the woman and risk wrath, or hand her over and bind a handful of teeth and rage to his own hands. "You will be safe here tonight," he said finally, like a verdict handed down with the least possible tenderness. "Soren will watch the perimeter. You will be brought to the infirmary." His voice held no softness, but it held promise in an American way, practical, unromantic. When the beta nodded and moved, the pack organized like tide. Soren came forward to offer a cloak that smelled of wolf and leather. Up close, Mira could see Soren's hands were large, calloused, the knuckles scored by years of fighting at Kieran's side. There was a gentleness in the way his fingertips brushed her arm, almost a relief, almost a threat. Within him roiled something more complicated than obedience. As they walked toward the den, the forest seemed to narrow and the moon to widen. Voices whispered like leaves, speculation leaking before the story could gather shape. A shadow had seen Mira's crescent, a messenger ravened into the night on wings of gossip and side deals. Rival packs would hear. The village priest would talk. Grayfin's enemies would sharpen knives. Inside the den, the infirmary was a small room where herbs hung in string and the smells of lavender and iron mingled. Mira sat on a hard cot, the cloak heavy on her shoulders. She watched Kieran as he closed the door, and for a moment his alpha mask slipped, a man whose decisions were lonely, who had built walls to protect others and, in doing so, had walled out parts of himself. There was a rumor about him that made other alphas wary. Kieran had once loved without claiming, and the memory of that love had softened and weakened him, a vulnerability the pack protected with a mixture of reverence and fear. Soren set a bowl of warm water and steady hands to wash her wound. The brush of his touch was mechanical, a healer's skill, a beta's habit, yet his eyes kept shooting to Kieran like a man checking if a sleeping king was still breathing. "You shouldn't have come," Soren said finally. "Not cruel, but real. You don't know what you carry." "What if I do?" Mira's voice was quieter now, threaded with something like defiance. "I know how to stitch a wound. I know how to bind a fever. I don't know how to be a bridge between your world and mine." Kieran paused at the doorway, the moonlight carving his outline. "Bridges break," he said, "and when they break, they take people with them." Mira wanted to say, "Then let me be the bridge." She wanted to ask him for protection and to promise him nothing. Instead, she watched his silhouette and felt an odd friendship with danger. The way it loomed, the way it might save her or consume her. He was an alpha who kept wolves at bay and desired nothing to ruin his pack. She, a healer from a humdrum village, carried a mark that could reweave the world's seams. Between them hovered the cruel geometry of power, his authority, her vulnerability, Soren's hunger, and the unknown eyes waiting in the dark. As the needles of the firewood crackled beyond the door, the moon climbed toward fullness. The den hummed with cautious breath. Somewhere in the wood a rival howl answered, thin and bright. The night did not promise safety. It promised change, and change, once touched by the moon, seldom retreated. Night pressed its weight against the den's wooden walls, and the pack's quiet movements sounded like promises being measured. The lantern threw a thin circle of yellow, and Kieran's outline sharpened when he crossed before it. Soren worked with steady hands, folding linen, dipping thread, humming an old lullaby that belonged to the hills rather than the wolves. The hymn filled the small room and smushed the edges of shame inside Mira's ribs, making them ache in a different way. "You said the priest saw the mark when you washed?" Kieran asked. His voice was low, controlled, like water under ice. He did not move toward her. His posture was a law in itself. She watched him and felt the old pull of a moon in a new shape, part fear, part magnetic ache. He carried the kind of authority that made people smaller and safer at once, and Mira wondered which she wanted to be tonight, the woman who shrank or the one who braced her shoulders and burned. "He saw something," she repeated. "He said the priestess of my village told him the moon punishes what it doesn't own." The words tasted like iron. They tie things they don't understand. He grabbed me by the wrists. I cut him, not because I wanted to, but because my hand moved when he tightened. It was reflex. I ran. I heard wolves calling, and I followed them until I almost walked into you. Kieran's jaw worked. You could have been hurt worse. He said it with no mockery, only the dry fact of consequence. The Alpha's mind ran on contingencies, what other villages would hear, which traders might whisper, which hunters would wag their knives for a bounty. A moon-touched human was currency. Even if he wanted to shelter her, he weighed the ledger with a man who had learned to measure vital things in costs. "You understand the risk you bring?" "I do." Mira's fingers tightened on the edge of the cot. "But I don't see a life where I hide and stitch and tell no one." "I thought the wolves would." She stopped, the rest of the sentence clinging like cobwebs. She had thought the wolves would understand longing because the night understood how the heart could stretch toward its own echo. Saying so made her sound mad. "I thought I could learn from you." Soren's laugh was sharp. "Most people think the wolves are teachers," he muttered. "Most people fall in love with the idea of being known." His fingers paused, then moved again, steadying the bandage with a surgeon's efficiency. He met Mira's eyes with a look that contained a softness she had not expected. "Do you understand what it means to be seen by us?" Mira swallowed. "It means being dangerous," she said, the truth a jagged thing and still somehow freeing. "It means no one will ever look at me and see only a woman bringing soup to a sick child." Kieran's pose slackened minutely, and in that fraction of slack, she saw the man beneath the mask, a person who carried the weight of things he could not undo. He stepped closer, and the pack's shadows leaned as if to listen. "If you stay," he said, "you will have obligations. The den is not a hospital for passing curiosities." His tone could have been a dismissal, but instead it felt like a map of limits. "You will learn our laws. You will not wander the borders at full moon. You will tell no one of our secrets." "And if I refuse?" she asked, voice thin as thread. He paused. For a moment, the room seemed to be held between his breath and his judgment. "Then I will have to return you to the village," he said. The threat was practical rather than cruel. The pack knew exile could be worse than death, because human superstition was a sharper blade than most claws. Kieran's eyes were storm gray, and she saw something like regret flit across them, a memory of a decision he had made once that had bred ghosts. And if word spreads, other threats may come. Soren watched them both with something like pain in his gaze. "Or," he said finally, voice low, "we bind the risk with rules. We teach her how to walk the moon. If she is moon-touched, she could be an asset, or a weapon." The word landed hard. Soren's loyalty had always been pragmatic. He had learned the price of idealism when it cost pack members their lives. But his fingers softened around the linen, betraying a tenderness he rarely offered. Mira felt the weight of their calculus, like a saddle settling on her ribs. An asset, a weapon. She had never been counted in such terms before. In her village, they counted her by how many roofs she'd mended, by how many winters she'd kept a fever from claiming a child. Here, under the moonlight, she felt turned into a thing with potential for alliances and slaughter. Her stomach flipped, and she wanted to throw it all away, to go back to the well and pretend the crescent under her skin was a trick. Instead, she breathed and watched Kieran's silhouette shift again. "We teach her," Kieran said at last. The word was not enthusiastic. It was necessary. "We bind her within the den on full moons until we understand how she shifts. We run scent tests, pulse under the moon, and, if needed, we consult the old pack council." It was the slow method of those who had learned the cost of haste. "You will not be left alone." Mira nodded because the alternative was unbearable. "And you," she asked, "what will you do for me? Will you watch me like a predator?" Kieran's face smoothed into an expression she could not read. "I will watch you like someone deciding whether to trust the river not to drown his child," he said bluntly. It was a bad metaphor and an honest one. "I will protect the pack. If you endanger it, if you become a beacon, then I will act." Her pulse ached. The truth was bare. She needed him to decide she could remain. She needed him to choose protection over politics, to pick her human life over the ledger of alliances he had been balancing for years. Power flared distastefully in his hands, and yet she felt something else, an ache like a door cracked open. The next days were a tightrope of new rules and tiny mercies. Soren taught her to move with less fear through the den, to carry warmth without letting the scent of her separate into separate threads. He made her practice at dawn, holding her arm as if correcting a stitch in cloth, guiding her steps so she wouldn't be startled by the echo of paws. In those quiet hours, she noticed the small things that had once gone unseen. The way the pack shared a single pot of stew and quarreled in low, familiar rumbles. The way Kieran's laugh, when he allowed it, at the rare joke, was like a shutter opening. The scar on Soren's knuckles that averted his thumb's motion, as if someone once had clipped it away. Kieran, when he was near, moved with a distance that left her raw. He insisted on checking her bandages himself, and the proximity was a punishment and an invitation. Once, his fingers brushed the crescent at her hip while adjusting a strap, and she felt the world tilt into a private axis. The contact was light, clinical almost, but it singed using the same inferno as confession. Soren's face, which had been warm with instruction moments before, snapped tight with jealousy. A storm of old loyalties hummed between them. There was a love unspoken, folded into duty, and Mira realized she had stepped into the middle of a history that smelled like salt and smoke. Outside, the borders seethed with rumor. A raven came to Kieran with a scrap of news. A neighboring Alpha had asked pointed questions at market stalls. A priest had begun to gather men from the border villages. Word was a living thing. It fed itself on fear. Kieran's decisions tightened. More than once, he called counsel with Soren and 2 other senior packs, and each time the words landed heavy. Alliances fragile, votes to be swayed, promises to be bought. Mira listened from the infirmary's doorway and felt as if she were a needle on a map around which armies circled. Soren warned her in the evenings with a directness that startled. "You must be careful whom you tell," he said, sitting beside her as the den hummed with sleep. His face held a seriousness that felt like confession. "There are people in this world who will not see you as a person. They will see you as leverage. Don't fall for the idea of romantic things." "I'm not falling for anything," Mira said, half laughing, half choked. It was a lie. She had already felt Kieran's presence tug at something raw and open in her, a need to be not just protected, but known. Still, she appreciated Soren's bluntness. He had a way of saying what others circled around like hunters at dusk. "You will be used if you are soft," he continued. "If you show anyone that you want more than shelter, it will be a weakness." The words stung because they were the truth of the den. Pack life was a negotiation of strength and the appearance of it. Soren's own pain, his hunger for a life beside Kieran that had been barred by law and pride, made him brittle. He cared for Mira in the way a man cares for a fragile thing he fears losing to a rival. Tender, but with a glove over his tenderness. Mira felt the shifting of loyalties as a current underfoot. Kieran remained the axis. Everything else orbited his decisions. He visited her with clinical questions about the crescent. Did she dream differently? Did the moon make her thirst? And each time, his concern was a blade and balm at once. With each answer, he grew a shade more protective. And the climate in the den shifted. Some of the pack whispered their approval. Others watched with tight jaws. To be under his eye was to be safe. And to be under his eye was to be bound to consequences that could burn. One night, when the moon sat like a coin caught in a tree, Mira found Soren staring at her like a man bereft of an anchor. "Do you want to be claimed?" he asked at last, in a voice that diced its way through the den's hush. The question hit her like a splinter. It wasn't about romance. It was about being named, owned, given a place on an animal map. She did not have the luxury of poetic answers. Her throat constricted with anxiety and possibility. "I want to choose," she said. "I don't want to be taken because someone needs a trophy or because a pack wants leverage." Her words were firm because the idea of being chosen by convenience made something clench in her chest. "If I stay, I need to be part of the decision, not the prize." Soren's expression shifted in a way that made her hope and fear braid together. He reached out, pressing his hand to hers like a pledge. "We'll keep you," he said, voice low, "but you'll be told every truth, not just the pretty ones." There was a grief in his admission. It was the kind of vow made when someone knows no better language for love. That night, Mira thought of the village well and the priest's hands, of her mother's laughter when she mended a seam. She imagined all the small pieces of her life and how many of them would be scattered if she stepped into this larger world. But when she thought of the moon mark glowing like a promise beneath her skin, she did not feel fear alone. She felt a fierce, tender curiosity, an ember that might become a blaze. Outside the den, the wind whispered like gossip. A distant howl answered the moon, thin and bright. In the den, the pack settled into its uneasy, watchful breathing. Mira lay awake a long time, thinking about choices and claims, feeling the strange truth widen in her. To survive here, she must be something more than the quiet healer she had been. She would have to negotiate power with men who had learned to shape the world with claws. She would have to demand a voice in a place that prized silence. And somewhere beneath those new fears, there was a glinting line of something else, maybe hope, that she would have to find the courage to follow. The first crack came like a whisper of ice across the den, small, almost ignorable, until it split into a chorus of sharp voices. It was a barter, a casual comment at first. A trader had seen Mira in the market before she fled, he said, seen the way the moon silvered the edge of her skirt. A throat cleared in the council room. Words landed in measured silence that carried a threat. Kieran's face was a hard thing when he heard it, carved and immediate. He called a meeting that smelled of wet wool and old tobacco, and the senior pack gathered like storm clouds. Soren, of course, a taut line of loyalty with eyes that never quite stopped from scanning Kieran. Myre, an older alpha from the north with a braided scar and a mouth that had never been taught gentleness. Rowan and Het, allies who balanced favors and favors owed. And a quiet third, Willa, who had been near Kieran the night he'd lost something he never named. "You bring news," Kieran said, voice a flat surface. Speak it plain." The trader's boy stammered and then spat the truth. Someone from a rival pack, the Ashmores, had been seen asking too many questions at the well in Mira's village. Rumors had always been the currency of the borderlands, and now they were being minted into coin. An alpha could turn a moon-touched human into a bargaining chip, a symbol to intimidate a rival or to extort loyalty. "They'll come," the boy said. His teeth clicked in his mouth like a broken trap. Kieran's response was a blade wrapped in velvet. "We will not be blackmailed by fear." But even as he said it, the muscles in his jaw worked. He had made that vow, protect the pack, and sometimes protection required sacrifice that scraped the edges of a conscience. The council exchanged looks. Myre's voice rang like flint. "If we hide her here, we invite war. If we hand her over to keep bread and borders, we teach our enemies how to bargain for our bones." Rowan, pragmatic, suggested sending word to neighboring packs, building a web of witnesses to the truth of Mira's protection. Willa, with her quiet righteousness, argued for secrecy and a small circle of trust. Soren watched Kieran the way a keeper watches a beast. What decision would he make when the law and the heart bled into each other? There was more under Soren's restraint than property. His eyes hinted at a personal ledger of longing and loss. He understood the history of Kieran's choices and the cost of leaning too far on mercy. "If they want leverage," Soren said quietly, "we must make giving us leverage unprofitable." "You mean attack," Mare said sharply. "Or make the price too high to pay," Soren countered. "Expose them. Show them the cost of touching one of ours." His suggestion carried heat. It promised retaliation. Kieran's mouth tightened. Revenge was a dangerous language for an alpha to speak. Once uttered, it bound him as surely as it bound any rival. Mira heard the meeting from the infirmary cot like distant thunder. Each syllable about her shifted the ground beneath her feet. She had hoped, in a small and foolish way, that her presence could be a quiet thing, a strange anomaly, acknowledged and tucked away. But she was not a tucked thing. She was a fulcrum now, and the pack's decisions would pivot on her like a world. Her hands curled in the blanket until the wool bit into her palms. When at last Kieran came to the infirmary, the look on his face was tired, as if the meeting had stripped him and left him naked to the night. "They know," he said simply. He sat on the edge of the cot with a motion that made the wood sing. Ashmore smells for weakness, and priests smell for anything they can blame. They're both clever. Mira's voice was thin. "What will you do?" Kieran's answer was not immediate, because an alpha always measured the future like a tapestry. See the knots now to prevent a snag later. "We will protect you," he said. Then, softer and dangerously private, "but the protection will cost us." There was a gravity to his words that made her feel like a coin being weighed in a scale. "We will train you. We will test you. I will make the den a shield, but you must obey the rules. If you break them, if you leave the den and become bait, there will be consequences." "It isn't fair," she murmured, not to him, but to the room, to the moon, to the world that had never bothered to be fair. "I didn't choose any of this." Kieran's hand hovered over hers for a heartbeat, an offense in many packs, an act of ownership in others. He did not press. He simply let the possibility linger like steam. "No," he agreed, and the single word was uncomplicated and heavy. "But you will learn to choose differently." The fractures began with a whisper and widened into open cuts. A message arrived through a hunter. The priest in Mira's village had spoken to a man from Ashmore. They had traded information for promises of protection. The idea that a human could be a bargaining chip sent a ripple of fury through the den. Soren's jaw set like a strop. They will not use a person to trade favors, he snarled, and for the first time his restraint cracked into something combustible. He wanted to hunt, to tear the treaty threads from the other packs and show them the cost of such bargaining. Kieran stopped him with a look that had been sharpened by years of buying peace with blood and silence. We will not start a war over one woman, but we will not surrender her either. Those words should have settled the issue, but they split into two different things in the mouths of other leaders. Some heard negotiation, some heard cowardice. Rumors turned teeth on that ambiguity. "You are indecisive," Mayer said, voice like stone. "A leader who cannot choose stands to lose everything." Soren's approach shifted. He began to counsel aggression, a dangerous blend of past hunger and present fear. "Strike first," he told Kieran late one night, his voice low with a wolf hunger Mira felt even through the den's closed doors. "Take them by surprise. Teach them that a pack that cannot protect its own will be devoured." Kieran's response was a soft curse. "If we take them by force, we open doors that we can never close," he said. "We risk innocent lives. We risk being what we hate." The memory of the choice he had once made, years ago, when he'd had a chance to take a life to secure a treaty and instead had folded, rolled across his shoulders like a weight. He was an Alpha who had learned the cost of certain victories. Soren's patience frayed. "And if we don't act, they will think you weak," he snapped. His voice cracked like a whip. In the den, whispers rose in immediate support or denunciation. The fracture lines began to show in small ways. Soren volunteered for patrols that others might have done. Mayer pulled two fighters aside and murmured about shifting alliances. Rowan and Het exchanged ledger-like looks, calculating. Mira felt herself carried like a stone in a stream, pushed by currents not her own. She recognized the cruelty of being objectified, but she also recognized something darker. The pack's fear for its own survival often wore a face that looked like hatred for outsiders. She sat in the infirmary and stitched wounds not only of flesh, but of the pack's own fraying trust. She could feel Soren's eyes on her when she walked through the den, a mixture of hunger and guilt that made her body a map of conflicting claims. Secrets, too, began to unspool. Willa, in a night of too much fire and too much wine, took her to one side and told her truths that tasted like rust. There had been moon-touched before, she said. One, a boy who had been hidden and trained into a spy, had betrayed a trust and burned a line of allies. The pack had changed laws then, made boundaries stricter. We learned the hard way, Willa said, voice small. We were careless and the cost was paid with lives. There are more wolves out there who would exploit your kind. Secrets keep us safe sometimes. Willa's words held both apology and reproach. That night, Mira no longer felt the moon as a soft pull, but as a ledger of possibilities. Some that might save her, and some that might condemn her. She understood the scars in Soren's hands as if they were a history she'd read in a book. Each callus told a story of a time when rules had been broken and someone had paid. Kieran's solitude, too, read like a map of old betrayals. The more she learned the pack's history, the more she understood that her presence awoke things that had been sleeping with one eye open. The den's atmosphere shifted from cautious to tense. Conversations creaked under the weight of possibilities. Old friends argued about the rightness of law versus the tenderness of mercy. Bonds that had been solid for years shriveled under the heat of fear. Loyalties hardened into brittle things. Soren's behavior became more possessive, more urgent. He began to hover at her doorway at odd hours, a sentry who watched more than protected. Once, when he stepped too close and his hand brushed the crescent at her hip when he adjusted a band, his face lost its color and something like confession dropped from him. "I would tear the world for you," he muttered, half to himself, half to the night. Kieran caught the edge of the confession and did not like it. When two wolves love the same ground, the earth changes, and something in him went cold. He had always been a man of measured choices, but Soren's unguarded hunger made old bones ache in new ways. The pack watched, and the den's delicate weave of authority and affection started to fray. Rumors leaked beyond the walls. A hunter saw Soren riding at night with too much speed. A trader reported Kieran's council growing more divided. The world beyond Grafen smelled blood in the air and sharpened knives. Then, at the worst possible hour, a messenger arrived with a brazen and humiliating demand. Ashmore's Alpha, in a voice carried by a man too drunk on his own threat, offered an alliance on a single term. "Surrender the moon-touched human to our custody for 3 moons, and we will cede you the trade route on the Eastern Pass." The note was a blade wrapped in silk. Kieran's hands closed until his knuckles shone. Soren's reaction was immediate, animal, and clean. "We will cut them down," he spat, and every instinct in him leaned toward a war that would be quick and loud. Kieran, however, looked like a man who had been to the bottom of sharp decisions and had come up stained. "We will not barter a person," he repeated, "but we will not be reckless." Soren's loyalty, ever fierce, twisted, then split into two. The urge to honor Kieran's will, and an older hunger to prove himself worthy of a claim that the pack's laws denied him. He began to push for measures that threatened to undermine Kieran's authority, calling for preemptive raids, for showing strength that might be mistaken for cruelty. A wedge grew between the Alpha who wanted to preserve lives and the Beta who wanted to preserve honor. Mira watched the fracturing like watching frost spread across a pond. She hated that the shape of her life had become a lever in a war between men who had sworn to protect those under them. She hated wearing the crescent and being a symbol. But beneath the rage, another feeling unfurled: fierce determination. If the pack would tear itself apart over her, she will find a way to stop the tearing. If she was to be a bridge, she will learn to hold weight. In the echoing hush before dawn, when the den was a nest of restless bodies, Kieran came to her and spoke with a bluntness that had no room for ceremony. "I can't let you be bartered. I cannot," he said, and the pronoun was not about the pack, but about the way he felt being an Alpha responsible for lives he could not always save. "But I will not start a war without certainty." He named the practicality of a strategy. Test her, teach her, find proof of what she was and what she could be. Mira looked at him, at the man whose decisions made and unmade futures. "And if you find I am dangerous?" she asked, voice small and steady. "Then we will contain the danger together," Kieran said, and for once his words had no decree in them, only partnership. It was a promise that cut through the den like a shaft of moonlight. Not to own her, not to bargain her away, but to stand beside her and weigh the cost. Soren, learning of the plan, did not find it comforting. He saw it as stalling. He saw it as a delay that might let an enemy strike. The wedge between him and Kieran deepened into a narrow crack that might split at any tremor. In the meantime, the world watched, humans and wolves alike, and prepared to take sides. Secrets had been revealed, fractures had been opened. Now, under the moon's indifferent eye, the pack balanced between war and restraint, between ownership and partnership. Mira felt the pull of her own agency like a muscle she had to learn to use. If she was to survive the next moons, indeed, if the den would survive them, she had to be more than a symbol. She had to step into the cruel middle of decisions, to face the men who loved and feared her, and to make a choice that would change all of them. The first gunshot. That is how it felt. A sound that wasn't from any weapon, but a rupture. It came on the second night after Ashmore's demand, a howl that shredded into orders. Soren returned from patrol with his face carved by rage. He had found a scouting party too close to the Eastern Pass, a deliberate provocation. He wanted immediate reprisal, teeth and blood. Kieran met him on the threshold of the council with the cold steadiness of a man who had learned to weigh grief against sacrifice. "We strike at dawn," Soren said, voice raw as pulled sinew. "We show them that we don't trade our people. We take the pass before they can muster. Force yields where fear is constant." Kieran's reply was a single, slow breath. "We do not go to war to scratch pride," he said. "We go to war to save lives. Revenge will not restore what we lose." His words were iron tempered in gentleness, and they didn't land like balm. They landed like a verdict. Around them, the pack split, like ice underfoot cracking into ragged pieces. Mira listened to their arguments through a thin curtain of wool and fear. She had not wanted to be a signal flare, but she would not be the thing that started a war either. She thought of the village priest's hands, of the well, of Soren's raw face and Kieran's steady jaw. She could feel the moon mark at her hip like a pulse. It had become something alive and hungry, and, against all sense, protective. She rose then, quietly, and walked into the council. Her presence halted the argument like a thrown stone stopping ripples. The pack turned. A woman, human, unclaimed, with the crescent glowing faint beneath linen, stood in the middle of wolves and men and demanded a voice. It was audacious, and it was the truth. "You will not fight for me," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It tremored with something fiercer, will. "If you call for war without me, you use me as bait. You will tear the den for leverage and then bury the ruins beneath the excuse of honor." Soren's face went taut. Kieran's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time the whole room saw her not as currency, but as a hinge. "What would you have us do?" Kieran asked. There was no softness in the question, only the hard need for good answers. Mira had a plan that scalded with risk. "We will not meet them with teeth at dawn," she said. "We will go to Ashmore as a council of truth. We will show them that surrendering a life for a trade route is a line they cannot cross. We will gather witnesses, traders, villagers, anyone who will stand and swear. If they refuse, then we will have the moral high ground. If they accept, we have a treaty." The idea was part bluff, part strategy. It was exactly the kind of risky diplomacy Kieran did not favor, and exactly the kind of movement Soren wanted to avoid because it required patience over fury. Mare barked a laugh. "You would send a healer to negotiate with an alpha?" she scoffed. "Child, you do not understand our world." Mara's eyes didn't blaze. They bored into the older alpha with the quiet of someone who had stitched more lives than Mare. "Then let me bring witnesses," she said. "Let me speak to their villages. They think we fear them because we cannot prove they break codes. Let us call their bluff. Let us make peace or make proof." Kieran's mouth set. He measured the plan with the same calculus he had learned to use to keep wolves alive. It was dangerous. It was also the kind of cunning that could unmake a pretext for war without spilling blood. He looked at Soren, searching the boy who had become a man for the hunger behind his loyalty. Soren's hands curled. "You go with her," he said, finally, each word a weighing. "You will take a small contingent. We will show strength in presence, 2 cohorts. If they betray us, we strike. If they concede, we save lives. Reluctant praise softened his edge. He had always protected Kieran's authority by being its blunt instrument. Now his voice offered a weapon forged of patience instead of immediate violence. Kieran nodded, a motion that brought the council to something like a pause. "We will do it carefully," he said. "We will not peddle you like a prize, Mira. You will go with a sworn guard. You will speak as you wish. You will not be left alone." Mira agreed, though the thought of stepping into Ashmore, into a den smug with expectation, made bile rise at the back of her throat. Soren would be at her flank. Kieran would send Rowan and Het as watchful anchors. Willow would come too, quiet and severe. They would be a showpiece, human and wolf standing equal in the light. It was dangerous because it assumed civility where none might be offered. It was brave because it forced their enemies to choose whether to be monsters in public. At dawn, they rode. The journey smelled of wet pines and the breath of animals. The pack's horses moved with the restraint of trained war horses, hooves striking a cadence like a heartbeat. Mira sat between Soren and Kieran, the air between the two men sharp with unspoken things. Soren's hand found hers once, a small, steadying anchor. Kieran's presence was a stone to her hip, solid, immovable. They were a triangle of authority and care, and the shape it made around her felt both confining and protective. Ashmore's gates opened with the lazy slowness of those who believe themselves superior. Alpha Rourke, a man with a jaw like a cudgel and arrogance inlaid in his posture, greeted them with practiced courtesy. He smiled like a trap. "To what do we owe the honor?" he purred. Mira stepped forward, and her voice did not falter. She spoke not as a supplicant, but as an arbiter of truth. She told the story of the well, of the priest's hands, of her wound. She asked the villagers if any man from Ashmore had offered protection in exchange for their silence. Quiet mouths eventually named a name, a hunter who traded information for promises of boundaries to be granted. Rourke's smile thinned. Kieran's posture remained composed, but his fingers tightened on his reins. Soren watched with something like caged lightning. Trader witnesses stepped forward. A smith spoke of deals. A woman from Mira's village, old, stooped, swore an oath that turned the meeting into something dangerous to deny. "You bring proof," Rourke said finally, his voice a slow grind. In the pause that followed, the town square held its breath. Kieran did not withdraw his line of protection. His eyes, when they found Mira's, were steady and unblinking. There was an unspoken bargain in them. If she could stand, he would. Rourke offered a public concession, less than full surrender, a promise of silence and indemnity for the villagers, meant to sound magnanimous. Soren's jaw dropped. He had hoped for humiliation, for palpable ruin. Instead, Rourke offered a bargain that kept his pride. Kieran accepted the terms with the same heavy hands that had once borne worse bargains. It was a victory wrapped in compromise. As they prepared to leave, Rourke stepped forward with a knife in his hand, but not to wound. He pressed it to his palm and let the smoke of iron rise, offering a small, bloody sign of accord. "Let there be no more trade in human suffering," he said. It was a public gesture, symbolic, and for all its pomp, it unstitched a thread that might have become a noose. The crowd murmured. The trader witnesses nodded. On the ride back, Soren exhaled like a man waking from deep water. The tension in his shoulders loosened. He looked at Kieran with something raw and almost grateful. "You kept your head," he said. The compliment was small and strocky and honest. Kieran's reply was a rare smile, cracked and private. "And you kept your teeth from tearing everything down," he answered. The exchange between them was small and intimate, and Mira felt like she had been the lever that let both men lower their weapons a little at once. But the victory did not come without sacrifice. On the second night after their return, scouts reported movement at the Eastern Pass. A small force, nothing like a full mobilization, but enough to suggest Ashmore had not forgotten the leverage it sought. Kieran made a choice that tasted of both stubbornness and tenderness. He would personally patrol the pass with a small contingent, a deterrent showing they would not cower. Soren insisted on joining him. Mira wanted to go, but Kieran would not permit it. Protection, he said. She argued she was not bait. He folded and held his ground. Her safety came with limits, but his presence would be a symbol that he would not trade her. They left at dusk. The moon slivered like a watchful eye. Mira stood at the den's threshold as the rider's shadows ate the path. Soren turned in the saddle, and for a moment his face was a map of every unspoken thing. He called to her, a rough whisper, "Come if you must." His voice was not a command, but a plea. Kieran's hand landed briefly on the pommel next to his, an authorizing touch that felt like permission and claim all at once. When they reached the pass, they found not an ambush, but a quiet stake. A single Ashmore scout left as a test. Sensing the trap, Kieran stepped forward, and what followed was not a battle, but a binding. He took the man prisoner and offered him to the border magistrate for public trial. It was justice that did not taste of bloodlust. It was a statement. Soren's relief unclenched into something like pride. He had been given the chance to be fierce and measured both. Later, in the hush after patrol, Kieran turned to Soren with an honesty that had been hard won. "There is a line," he said, gaze grave. "I will not barter a life, but I also will not let anger decide our laws." Soren nodded, eyes wet beneath the stubble. "And I will learn to wait," he said, and the words were a surrender as much as a vow. It was not simple. It was not complete. It was the beginning of a truth that would have to be re-earned day by day. When they returned to the den, the pack gathered like a breath held and then released. Wounds had not been shed in blood that day, and that in itself was a kind of mercy. The den hummed with a new note, respect, tentative and raw. Mira walked between the men and felt the curve of power bend around her in new ways. Kieran met her eyes and did not command. He offered something simpler, more terrifying and more tender, trust. "I will stand with you," he said, and the sentence was short, but it carried the heft of a man willing to be less alone in his decisions. Soren's hand came to rest on Kieran's shoulder in a gesture that had once been ownership and now felt like alliance. "And I will stand by you both," he added, voice cracked but steady. In the weeks that followed, the den learned new rituals, of consultation, of limits, of letting those who must choose have a say. Mira trained with Soren and Rowan, learning how to read scent and sound, to anchor herself in a body that sometimes hummed with the moon. Kieran watched her with an intensity that was no longer hunger alone. It was stewardship, something like reverence. He did not claim her as property, he claimed her as partner in the small ways that matter. He sought her counsel on patrol routes. He asked about herbs that soothed pack fever. He stood outside her window when the moon rode high and simply kept vigil. The cost had been palpable. Rumors still curled at borders. Some allies remained wary, and the pack bore scars where old fractures had opened. But redemption came not as a sweeping miracle, but as a series of small reckonings. Soren learning restraint without losing his edge. Kieran learning to share the burden of command. Mira learning to step into voice without becoming object. On a night when the moon was fat and generous, Mira walked to the river alone. The crescent at her hip caught the light and shone like a lamp. She thought of all she had been forced to become: a hinge, a bargaining chip, a bridge. She understood finally that the moonbite had not made her lesser or a prize. It had made her necessary, a strand that, if held gently, could bind two worlds instead of tearing them. A shadow fell across the water. Kieran stood there, quiet as a promise. He sat by her without touching, and for a long time they watched the moon's reflection shiver. When he finally spoke, his voice broke like the tide. "I will not barter you," he said. "I will not trade you for peace that smells of bones. If this den bleeds because of you, then I will bear some of that blood, but I will not make you my prize." Mira reached for his hand and found his fingers cold and sure. "Then let us be partners," she said, and the word felt like a covenant. He closed his other hand over hers, not to own, but to steady. Soren watched from a distance, a smile cracked and vulnerable on his face. He had given something hard, the right to choose. It was the truest sacrifice he could offer. Outside, the pack howled once, an answering chord to the moon. Inside, treaties shifted like tectonic plates. Lives would still be risked. Loyalties would be tested. But the center had moved. Where once stood a ruler who took and punished, now stood an alpha who could yield, a beta who could restrain, and a human who had found voice. Together, they had made a small, dangerous kind of redemption, the choice to protect a life without choosing to own it. The den settled into a rhythm both new and careful tonight, like a quilt stitched by hesitant hands and wolves. Kieran moved through duties with a softness he had never shown, but his edges remained watchful as for the pack. Soren learned to temper hunger with patience, finding honor beyond possession. He taught Mira how to stand in storms without. Mira's voice grew steady. She stitched wounds and words into fragile peace, her choices shaping a new law where consent mattered. They rebuilt rituals that honored both old codes and new mercy. Elders taught restraint as courage, and wolves learned to listen. Nights softened. Moonlight no longer branded Mira as threat, but as beacon. She walked borders with confidence and spoke truth. Kieran learned to ask instead of decree, each question a bridge. It terrified him and opened him to tenderness quietly. Soren gave Mira space to choose and learned his own grace. He let Kieran lead without losing fierce devotion. The border treaties shifted. Ashmore's threat cooled under public scrutiny as traders and villagers swore truth and refused currency of fear. Mira stood at the river, moonbite glowing like a lamp. Her hand in Kieran's was neither claim nor captivity, but pact. They built a small council where human voices sat at wolf tables, where Mira taught herbs and law translated into mercy. Patrols changed, less spectacle, more presence, showing borders could be kept without turning people into coin. Soren took long walks with Kieran, learning to name hunger and let it go, sometimes laughing like a man surprised by his own hands. Willa and Mara softened into guardians who could bear both teeth and tenderness. Rowan and Het learned that power without restraint left hollows behind. Mira kept teaching children to sew and men to stop when fear rose in their throats. She mended torn shirts and old loyalties with equal patience. On nights when the moon was full and wide, Kieran sat with her by the river and asked how the light felt. She answered in herbs and small stories, and he listened as if learning a language he had once rejected. Soren watched sometimes from a distance, his smile cracked and true. He had given up claim and gained a deeper fidelity instead. In the hush before dawn, the pack howled together. a sound that was no longer hunger alone, but an agreement, to protect without owning, to fight when necessary, but choose mercy when possible. The moonbite glowed on Mira's hip, small and steady, and beneath it a new world began to heal, threaded by hands that had learned to hold rather than take.